This is, I guess you could say, your coup de jour, the tour de force, or whatever you want to call it, that this is your singular own theory, I want to say,
Sure.
that you kind of came up with on yourself. It's called the Great Founder Theory. So we'll get into kind of a breakdown, but before that, I just kind of want to prime listeners with a quote, and then also like a breakdown of like what it has issues with, because it's kind of hilarious how you start thinking about it and then all of a sudden you go down the rabbit hole and the fractal nature of it, that things are connected in so many different ways that you didn't even know. So, quote, the actions and capabilities of great founders determine the future social and material landscape of civilization, and thus the future of the world. Societies with many great founders will innovate and flourish, while societies with few will stagnate and deteriorate. So this is going to touch on, this is going to be a long list, so bear with me, government, law, political theory, social norms, diplomacy, ideology, strategy, credentials, education, cities, healthcare, sacrifice, rituals, psychotherapy, awards, marketing, marriage, adoption, dynasties. So what is the Great Founder Theory?
Well, the list you shared, which is from my book draft, which is available on my website, it's called Great Founder Theory. That is a list of social technologies that really change our society. Let's look at something like marriage. You might say that, oh, okay, our society, say, frowns on cousin marriage because we've developed away from it over the last few hundred years.
Like taboo nature.
It's a taboo nature.
Yes.
But a few centuries ago, like cousin marriage would have been seen as the obviously prudent choice, because keep it in the
groups,
family
yes,
was meant to literally, because the family was the fundamental economic unit of organization.
Yes.
That's no longer the case. Currently, it's the company. You might ask, what is the company? Well, it's supposed to be freely contracting individuals, but then if we are freely contracting individuals, why do companies exist? Why isn't it just like balls of like weird
Everyone's
consulting
their own
relationship?
companies.
Exactly, right? Why isn't that the case?
Yes.
And the answer is that these aren't quite purely contracting orgs. And I could talk about what companies exactly are. Coates' theory of the firm is like a fairly good first stab of that. And we could get rabbit holed on any of these other social technologies. But let's take it for a given that there are differences in how societies can organize themselves, even with the same level of material technology, right? One of my favorite examples often is, the printing press. People say, oh, the printing press made decentralization of society inevitable. We could have new ideas about theology. It was needed for the Protestant Reformation. And I'm like, yeah, that's all true. And the introduction of the printing press to Korean or Chinese society did no such thing. Material technology matters, but the different social technologies at play change how a society develops a technology further, how its culture changes, right? So I think that the sort of free parameter, the counterfactually important parameter, the thing that were it not for this, history would have gone differently, is actually innovation in social technology driven by great founders, where I also believe that most social technologies are too complex, they emerge too rapidly for them to truly be the product of like a pure kind of evolutionary approach, right? There are many things that do happen in that way, like a lot of language evolution changes over time due to the contributions, the minuscule contributions of many, many people being adopted into the culture. But when it comes
and how things change, families, etc.
Totally. But when it comes to, say, a code of law that's introduced or a new standardized system of accounting, well, that's often introduced by individuals. Like they might be prophets, they might be generals if it's a military reform, they might be statesmen. Not every quote-unquote great man is a great founder. I'm not here talking about people who just participate in momentous events. As highly as we might think of a general as, say, Patton, I wouldn't classify him as a great founder. Napoleon, on the other hand, maybe he is a great founder, but that's because of the military reforms and the legal reforms that lasted long after Napoleon was defeated.
Yeah, not necessarily his stride into Russia.
Exactly.
Like that's maybe a bad tactic, but overall the history and the legacy
is different because of his passing. And much the same is true of, say, Charlemagne, but it would also be true of, say, Confucius, it would be true of Aristotle, it would be true of, Muhammad or Jesus and so on, right? And, it's, once you put it in those terms, it sounds like common sense, but academically, this is a really underexplored area. It's hard to make a career out of saying that the future is unwritten, and social reforms are central to what happens to the future. It's hard to write like a good dissertation on this. It's hard to like make it small and defensible. So it has an easier time living outside of academia than in it, though I will acknowledge there is older academic literature that was quite developed on these theories of, say, individual-driven change. Now, why do I think it's individuals? Well, great founder theory does have a little caveat. It could be very small groups of people rather than just an individual, right? I do believe in scenius, the genius of a scene, where if you take an exceptional individual and they're not in the correct scene, their genius might be wasted. Failed genius is a common tragedy of human history. There are only a few correct situations where it can arise. And at the end of the day, if you're introducing new social technologies, you have to explain them and embody them with people. The reason Aristotle and Confucius are people that I would raise as possibly foundered here in this sense is because they created schools of thought. It wasn't Confucius himself, but Confucius's disciples that eventually executed the plan of getting hired by the emperor and then slowly reforming society to be more meritocratic and based on objective testing rather than inherited titles of nobility. And were it not for that, Confucius might be quite irrelevant for the flow of Chinese civilization after.
Right.
But he wasn't, right? They succeeded.
Much so that now you can't ask a Westerner, name a Chinese philosopher or something like that, and then that's going to be the first go-to.
Right, rather than Lao Tzu or someone else, right?
Yeah. So you just mentioned that kind of, and this will wrap up kind of the great founder theory, but we talked a lot about social technologies and the difference of physical technologies and such, and you kind of put an onus on the individual, institutional and then societal. But then can you like steelman your argument a little bit? Like, can you kind of maybe, not exactly poke holes, but what are some things like that's going to challenge maybe that?
People would obviously say that individuals are always a product of their circumstance.
I see.
And I would say possibly that's completely true. Perhaps we live in a totally deterministic universe, quantum effects notwithstanding or whatever.
Sure.
We live in a totally deterministic universe. So like, please tell me, how exactly are you going to compute the appearance of a Napoleon? I would say that in that case, in the very deterministic universe, the appearance of such equilibria breaking individuals or small scenes is a stochastic process. Right. It's completely unpredictable.
Right.
So
it'll just emerge out of everything rather than you telling it, well, it needs to happen in this particular parameter, this time frame, etc.
So if you want to produce a bounded theory that makes good predictions, you're not going to try to like figure out the exact details of this stochastic process. Instead, you're going to be like, okay, individual has emerged. What are the bounds of what this can do? This strange particle has entered your experiment. What happens next? And I think that's quite predictable.
It's interesting because the variables don't really matter. It's that fundamental kind of, I guess you'd say, what do they call it in initial conditions? I think that's a big way to put it.